Hello. My name is Lean Fouad, and I'm a researcher here with a Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. Welcome to our event on neglected crises with a focus on Myanmar, Syria, and Somalia. I'm joined today by my colleague Dustin Barter, who will be co-moderating this event, and we're also joined by an excellent panel who I will be introducing to you in just a few moments. This month commemorates two significant anniversaries. The 1st of February marks 3 years since the military coup in Myanmar, which displaced millions of people and triggered a people's revolution. The 6th of February, just 2 days ago, marked a year since the deadly earthquakes that hit northern Syria and southern Turkey, and which have had a disproportionately devastating impact on a population battered by over a decade of conflict. There are 18 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Myanmar, 16 million in Syria, and over 8 million people in Somalia. These are not just numbers, these are people in need, and needs are rising every day, and yet these crises have been effectively deprioritized or have even disappeared from public and international attention. So what are the implications of this continued neglect? And how can the situations in Myanmar, Syria, and Somalia teach us about humanitarian engagement in other neglected crises like Ethiopia and Sudan? And how can we shift the international response from inertia to action? And to answer these questions, we have an excellent panel of experts. Firstly, to my right, I have Mazen Ghariba, who's a policy researcher at the Conflict and Civicness Research Group at LSE. And then to his right is Dr. Surayar Muhammad, who's a research fellow at the University of Cambridge. And finally, I'd like to introduce Min Tent Bo, who's an independent analyst on human rights and democracy in Myanmar. A very warm welcome to you all. And yes, definitely they deserve a clap. And just before I hand over to Dustin to start the discussion, just some housekeeping for Q&A. So we have a large online audience, and as well as here in the room in ODI. So after we've heard from our three panelists, we'd like to hear from you, thoughts, questions, and reflections. So if you're online, please post your questions at the Q&A box at the bottom. And if you're here, we have a roaming mic that we'll be giving out at the end. And we also encourage you to tweet using the hashtag neglected crises, and potentially, if you can, using HPG's handle at HPG_ODI. And without further ado, I will hand over to Dustin to frame this discussion. Dustin, over to you.
Sure, thanks everyone for coming. I'll keep it brief so we can focus on the excellent panelists. But just two short vignettes, maybe. So I was chatting with a friend from an Australian NGO last week. And so when we're talking about neglected crises, there's obviously political, public, economic, many different dimensions to that. And they talked about the Ukraine fundraiser that their NGO did in Australia, and they raised $20 million, which is like quite a substantial amount of money. And in April last year, conflict kicked off in Sudan, and they did a similarly big organization-wide funding appeal and raised $80,000. So I did the maths, I needed a calculator, and it's about 250 times the public funding, public donations for Ukraine than what you got for Sudan. Not to mention that governments, through bilateral aid, are focusing much more on channeling money towards Ukraine rather than Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, Syria, and countless other crises. So when we talk about neglect, it's not just a government level aspect, but also public consciousness. What role does the media play? There's a lot of intersecting factors. So just to bear that in mind. And then this is a severe topic that we are talking about, and there's a lot of doom and gloom that is going to be presented, but also elements of hope within that. And yeah, I think just a brief quote from a Myanmar poet to get things started, who was killed by the military following the coup. He said, "They shoot at our heads, but revolution lives in the heart." So I will hand this over to Min to elaborate further.
I'm Min, independent analyst based in London, working on human rights and democracy in Myanmar. And I've been working for several NGOs and development missions for the last 18 years. And now I'm currently based here and then working mostly on Myanmar.
Mohammed. I'm the Harry F. Guggenheim Research Fellow at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and I look at urban post-conflict reconstruction in Mogadishu, Somalia.
I'm Mazen Ghariba. I'm from Syria. I work at the Conflict and Research Group at LSE, focusing mainly on Syria, but we also work on Yemen and South Sudan. In addition to that, I'm also a research fellow at the Middle East Center at the LSE, and I'm part of a Syrian diaspora-based group called the Syrian British Consortium.
So when we talk about international aid and international organizations, I would like to start, to all of you just sharing a bit about Myanmar as well. To begin with, UN is part of the problem, because in Myanmar, UN has been doing it for many years. For example, just using, they have this mentality that they think that they can work with the military that things can solve, which they fail miserably in Rohingya crisis. They prioritize economic development aid over human rights issue. For example, in 2017, when the genocide happened, before genocide broke out, right, it was just UN agencies are focusing more on, for example, the economic development, which was not surprising. A short story, Myanmar went through this resistance movement, the political crisis turmoil since 1948 after the independence from the British. But over all these 60 years, I would say the second longest civil war after Colombia. So this country is back and forth with the anti-military, taking over coup d'etat. And then when 88 comes, the people resist a revolution, and which is basically died out 3 years later. The military took over again. However, in 2011, country turned to change to a civilian, quasi-civilian transformation. Since then, at the time, what's supposed to happen for me and my other activist friends, we hoped at the time was to address a serious human rights issue, the problem in the grounds. But instead, no, it is completely whitewashed. International communities came in. They basically starting with this neoliberal ideology that the economics change will, will help lift the country from all the miseries. I criticized it a lot at the time. But however, I also wanted to part of the change process. So I worked in the election process and peace process. And then just because of that, you realize more and more, all these the aid money that go into millions for money are basically mostly by the international staff, and also even for some educated Burmese as well, just double consultancies, which completely neglect anything happening on the ground. But in a way also that people basically kind of believe that economic, change. You can see a lot of American companies, everyone came in, but at the end, just because of the root problems that didn't clear it out, at the end, it's basically back to square one. So that's a part of my first discussion, and I'll discuss further.
If you want to continue on.
Oh, okay. And after that, so for example, right now, with the coup that we've been calling out, basically encouraging the UN agency, international agency, to engage more with the local, organizations, they're let's say ethnic armed group organizations, local CSO. So far, it's happening on the ground, but very few. Recently, I think it was December 18 or 2020th, UNFPA boss in Myanmar bragged about that he was in Naypyidaw, very happy that he is meeting with the military, people to talk about SRHR. I'm just this is outrageous, right? Because these are the same people, the same military people who basically committed sexual violence and crimes against women. Me as a part of SRHR activist, I was actually very angry when I saw that. It's ignorant, arrogant, I would say. And when people start calling out the person, and I don't know what happened after that. So, for example, these kind of things that they still believe that you can, change, you work with them, and then it can change. And the next question is, is it really really, it's actually working right now in Myanmar. And, and also don't forget that the military can also weaponize, like aid as well. That's what they've been doing the whole time. So like, how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to, find solutions? Of course, it's $1 million questions, It's not like solution straight away. The same thing happened with the Rohingya crisis. Because like when I was writing a piece about international organizations' involvement in Myanmar, it's criticizing them, some people ask me, so what is the solution to the Rohingya genocide? I'm like, it's $1 million question, so no one can answer. But definitely there should be engaged more than than that. So that's what I would just say for now. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Min. And I think I'll hand over to Lynn.
So we've witnessed similar dynamics of revolt resistance, but also weaponization of aid in Syria. 13 years since the conflict started, there's a huge rise of humanitarian needs, but also at the same time a lack of political solution. So international support at the start of the conflict was quite strong, but then Syria has been deprioritized at the global stage now. So Mazen, what can you tell us about this neglect and this continued neglect in Syria?
Thank you, Lean. Thank you so much. And as you said, this week marks the first anniversary of the Syria-Turkey earthquake, and I believe my intervention actually will be focusing on that, what happened last year, because I believe it offers a painful lesson about the devastating consequences of neglected crisis. So a little bit of context. Last year, on February 6th, a series of earthquakes hit southern Turkey and northwest Syria, claimed the lives of 50,000 people in Turkey and 6,000 people inside Syria. Most of these casualties were concentrated in northwest Syria. Northwest Syria is a region that has been outside of the regime control for over decades. It's an area that has been witnessing almost daily aerial bombardments from the Syrian army and the Russian armed forces as well, including the use of chemical weapons at several occasions, including, of course, what we call the Khan Sheikhoun massacre, when the Syrian regime used chemical weapons against civilians at a large scale. So when the earthquake happened, for almost a week after the earthquake, which any expert on humanitarian crisis would tell you that the 48 hours after any earthquake are the most critical hours to save people. But what happened in Syria, that for over a week, no international aid reached northwest Syria. Nothing reached northwest Syria. So the local response to the earthquake, to the devastating earthquake, in an area that already been devastated by the war, was carried out by local NGOs, understaffed, underfunded local NGOs, primarily the Syrian heroes, what they call the Syrian Civil Defense, the White Helmets, are the ones who actually started rescue operations. Despite them as well losing loved ones and homes, but they were able to save thousands of people from under the rubble. But of course, talking to any of them, they will tell you that if some assistance reached them, within 48 hours, they could have saved more lives. So what really happened was international rescue teams were, as you see on the news, were deployed. Thankfully, they were deployed to Turkey. And of course, here we have to say that Turkey was overwhelmed because it was the epicenter of the earthquake, and the Turkish authorities, they were also overwhelmed by the massive consequences of the earthquake. So thankfully, a lot of countries sent international rescue teams to southern Turkey. However, no rescue team actually were allowed to cross Syria. And I met several members of these international rescue teams, and they told me that they were begging their government just to cross 5 kilometers into Syria because they can see it. And they were not allowed to cross the borders for geopolitical considerations. The UN also waited for almost a week to send any sort of meaningful aid to Syria. Of course, some of the colleagues at the UN would say, well, that's not true. We sent something 72 hours after the earthquake, and to that we say that's not true, because the convoy that was sent 72 hours was actually already scheduled, and the convoy is already waiting at the borders 4 days before the earthquake, and actually the convoy had non-food items and hygiene kits, so local NGOs couldn't do anything with it because they were asking for heavy machineries, for rescue dogs, and for these sort of things, but nothing of that sort arrived. Why? Because the UN, despite having a mandate and despite having something in Syria called the cross-border aid resolution, decided to wait for the consent of the Syrian regime to use a cross-border that's not controlled by the Syrian regime, to send international aid to an area that's not controlled by the Syrian regime. And of course, the Syrian regime, who's already been bombing this area for 12 years, decided to wait to absolutely the last minute to give that consent. Even though that many legal experts and many NGOs, including Amnesty International, actually released legal arguments saying that this is a violation of the UN Charter, because there is international humanitarian law that sending impartial, life-saving humanitarian assistance to an affected population to alleviate the suffering of affected population in hard-to-reach areas does not amount to interference in the sovereignty of the state, and it's part of the UN mandate to deploy rapid response plan, but this hasn't happened at all. So many lives were lost unnecessarily because of the politicization of the aid, because of the UN lack of willingness actually to act upon its mandate and its charter to save Syrians. Of course, here there are many lessons to be learned from what happened, the earthquake, and I believe I will focus on 4 of these lessons. Firstly, it shows, and the entire Syrian conflict, to be honest, it shows the shortcomings of the international humanitarian framework that doesn't really take into consideration the realities of civil wars and internal conflict and intrastate conflict. Because this, as you know, this system, the humanitarian system, was built to deal with interstate violence, right? Like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it doesn't really equipped to deal with the nuances of civil wars and internal conflicts. So we need substantive review and substantive changes to the international assistance framework. And we need to understand that each country is specific, and we need to have certain policies in order and flexibility in order to deal with that, with these sort of crises. The second lesson, I would say, is that the importance and centrality of local NGOs and local CSOs in addressing compound crises. And which means that the necessity of enforcing the localization of aid agenda, which means that we need to support local NGOs and to support local CSOs in order to be able to respond when such crisis happens. And by localization of aid, because some donors interpret localization of aid as throwing money at local NGOs without doing anything. And that's not what we mean by localization of aid. When we talk about localization of aid, we mean do not treat local NGOs and civic actors as passive recipients of funds. Treat them as actual partners, that they are the ones who know the area, they know what to do, and they need to be on the table. They need to design the intervention, to design the needs assessment. They're the ones who actually know what's happening and what should happen. So they need to be partners, which also some humanitarian organizations call the accountability to affected population, AAP, which means that affected population we should be accountable to them by bringing them to the decision-making process, and also by preserving their human rights and human dignity. So that's something that I think Syria painfully illustrates, that the importance of enforcing such policies. The third lesson, I would say, is the role of the diaspora. So because of this, because of the abandonment that happened during the first week of the earthquake, something magnificent happened in the Syrian diaspora. All of a sudden, all of the people I know, Syrians outside of Syria, they came together. They organized fundraising campaigns. By the way, the fundraising campaigns that the Syrian diaspora organized exceeded the money that the UN sent, and exceeded the money that the UK government, by the way, sent. They helped with crowdsourcing, because of the thing is that most of the humanitarian organizations who respond to the humanitarian crisis here are located in southern Turkey, and they themselves were destroyed and abandoned and killed and disappeared. So a lot of NGOs outside of Syria actually tried to take their place in order for a week, in order for them to be able to stand again and to continue their operations. And I think that also shows us that including the diaspora and working with the diaspora is also something very important. The final lesson, I'm sorry if I'm taking so much time, The final lesson I would say is I think the root cause of a lot of neglected crises, and mainly Syria, is branding a politically driven crisis merely as a humanitarian crisis. This is not just a humanitarian crisis. A humanitarian crisis happened because of a political crisis that's happening in Syria. It's a symptom, it's not the root cause. But the international system, they deal with the symptom and they deal with it. And now if you watch the media, most of think tanks, they will say, well, Syria is a humanitarian crisis. It's not a humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. It's a political crisis that's been happening for over a decade. But rendering it as a humanitarian crisis means that there's no actual investment in the political process and political negotiation and a political solution in Syria. So it's now a frozen conflict. And I believe looking at Gaza, we can also all learn that rendering a political crisis as a humanitarian crisis or as a frozen crisis will eventually, it will blow up in all of our faces and it will have far-reaching consequences that no one can deal with. And I believe this is exactly what's happening in Syria. And I believe that if the international community didn't actually start investing in the political process and political solutions, not just in Syria, but all of our crises, nothing will really happen. And the Gaza scenario we will witness it all over the world over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazen. Excellent intervention on localization, accountability to affect population and political crisis. I'll hand over to Dustin.
Cool. So next up we have Sarah, who we kind of love this, the synergies between the different contexts and some of the overlapping dynamics as well, where we talk about the earthquake. Also in Myanmar, we had the cyclone Mocha last year that probably nobody's heard of because it just kind of went under the radar. The military cut off all access, and who really knows the extent of the damage. And so there's common issues around political crises, humanitarian crises, but also mutual aid, which maybe we'll have Min talk about later. But Soraya does a lot of amazing work around dynamics around urbanization and the importance of land and the centrality of land governance in relation to broader political settlements, but also drivers of conflict. And so really wanted to bring in Soraya's perspectives on these issues of kind of talking about, this transition periods as well from humanitarian crises to, longer term resilience and governance dynamics as well. So I'll hand over to Soraya.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to ODI for having me on this platform. I've learned already so much from my co-panelists, and honestly, I feel like if we just had a discussion about the throw lines and thematic throw lines, we could just have a conversation about that, and my entire intervention could just be, that's interesting, and we need to talk more about that, and that's something else. So I will restrain myself. I'd like to start by saying, I want to start by thinking a little bit about the question of inertia itself, and thinking a little bit about what it is that we are attempting to overcome. What does it mean to have inertia in this international system, and what does it tell us about the international pathways that we operate within? In the context of Somalia, inertia looks like protracted crisis. And by protracted, I mean complex and political social challenges that develop over the scale of decades as opposed to years or months. Protracted crises can engender a kind of political dynamic of their own, a political economy and infrastructure which supports the continuation of political, economic, or even environmental crises. And this is where I see my first reaching of the hand, because we have the question of cyclical environmental crisis in the context of particularly southern Somalia, which is definitely an environmental crisis. You have drought, flood, famine, right? But it's also a political crisis, a series of inabilities to be able to access governance structures, a series of inabilities to be able to think ahead towards the next crisis. And then so we have these cyclical funding drives year after year, which creates and drives itself a great deal of donor fatigue. So that's my first reach over, but I'm going to restrain myself. Political violence, when it's played out over the longue durée, has an effect on livelihoods, economic infrastructures, and possibilities of developing mechanisms of governance that meet the needs of communities. And it's true that the entrenchment of crisis also results in increasing complexity, right? So we have a rising number of communities, political groups, armed groups that become involved and implicated in the rising and spiraling challenge. There also might be questions about internationalization and external intervention. So this brings us to the question, in the context of protracted conflict, what is protracted? What is it specifically that actually survives? Put another way, what changes and what stays the same? So in the context of Somalia, we may look to Somalia for answers here. Somalia has been associated with a series of interlocking challenges from the collapse of the Somali state from 1991 onwards. And these interlocking challenges include the problem of non-state political violence, including warlords and contemporarily al-Shabaab, but then also challenges about what it looks like to reconstruct a state from the ground up, right? The increasing intensity of environmental crises that we've already alluded to. In the context of Somalia, two authors, Ken Menkhaus and Paul D. Williams, point to what they call durable disorder as a reason for protracted conflict. And they argue that protractedness emerges not necessarily from the longevity of particular dynamics, but the endurance of a particular kind of political economy of which humanitarian aid is a part, right? And support for peace operations, which they're particularly interested in, are a part. That doesn't mean that everything stays the same over the course of a decade, but they specifically highlight the transition from, for example, powerful armed groups, which engage in predatory activities like land grabbing and looting of food aid, into semi-legitimate political and private sector actors. I think that they call or term the move from warlord to landlord. At the same time, the endurance of these particular kinds of logics in political economy create what they call this dynamic of durable disorder, which implicates international humanitarian aid in the prolongation of protracted conflict, right? And so it's influenced by the overarching political economy. And so where in context where the endurance of intervention and the unshifting intervention, particular kinds of modalities of intervention can be relied upon, they argue that aid, procurement, service delivery contracts become principal locations of contestation and political intervention, right? And so this is one face of the particular kind of inertia that we're attempting to think about. So in my research, I look at something a bit more downstream. I'm thinking about how challenges with state governance have significant impacts on how land is used, owned, and operated in the context of Mogadishu, Somalia. So contrary to our narratives of endemic failure and crisis, Mogadishu has actually seen a striking building boom over the course of the past decade, growing rapidly, urbanizing at some rates, some estimates, a rate of 4% per year. That's actually an undercount if you ask urban planners within the city. But that's what we have on the World Bank, so we'll go with that statistic. The skyline of Mogadishu is changing rapidly. And this combined transformation has been really striking and a source of particular hope for interveners who say, look, this is where all this intervention has gone. Residential houses renovated, hotels, shopping malls, and restaurants open, communication and service infrastructures transformed, but unevenly assembled throughout cities. This is where, as well, I'm going to reach my hand out again and think a little bit about diaspora intervention and finance. That's a very significant amount of what's going on here, because Somalia is a very high-risk place for investment, unless you're within the context of Somalia itself. However, underneath this recovery lies a fractious series of contests over the ownership, management, and future of urban land. Land itself was a critical resource during the course of the wartime political economy, as armed groups appropriated and carved up public and private property within the city. In some estimates, some 80% of cases in front of courts have to do with land and property disputes. Simultaneously, communities of the urban displaced, and these are displaced communities emerging from climactic shocks in other regions or political instability, find refuge in the city, creating communities of effectively people with very little security of tenure, who themselves cannot rely upon the future of their locations. This leads to several interlocking challenges, which I'll consider very quickly. The first is that, of course, questions of land governance in Somalia are characterized by unclear and overlapping systems of governance and a lack of state capacity. And this creates a distinctly challenging system to navigate for state and citizens alike, as security of tenure can be validated and nullified by different parties, right? Second, you have the rapid urbanization of Somali cities significantly outstripping the capacity of urban and regional governments to administer them. And with this comes with particular kinds of urban and regional administration challenges and a strain on already limited governance resources. Third, you have the long-standing land disputes and contemporary land conflicts, which continue to be a trigger for instability and even violence in Somalia. And this is where conversations around what is politically feasible become really important, because politically, land was never a part of the peace-building process, particularly because of the fact that it is such a hot-button topic. And so there's a question around this tension between peace and justice that exists underlaying this. And there becomes a question around what is it worth, basically, in order to maintain a particularly kind of tenuous peace. Fourth, we have the question of the lack of enforcement and judicial capacity. And I'm going to move to fifth, which is the land grabbing and increasing commodification of land and the use of land to consolidate political alliances and patronage, which definitely emerges downstream from the kind of humanitarian issues that we discussed before. So in this context, and I think I'm nearing my ending point here, what can an analysis of Somalia's cities really tell us about this question of overcoming inertia? The first is that protracted conflict in and of itself does not necessarily mean stasis. There's an incredible amount of flexibility, fluidity, transformation, and change occurring within particularly the context of Mogadishu, but that this in itself is underwritten by significant thematic challenges that continue to call back to histories of violence, of grievance, of challenge, and that without an addressing of those particular central issues, we're going to continue to have these kind of depoliticized technocratic interventions that lead us in the place that we continually lack. There's also important questions that I would love to chat with you about knowledge accumulation and engagement and what it means to actually have, as you were talking about, questions around what localization really means. This is something in the academic space we often see where organizations will go into the context of Somalia and do very important knowledge accumulation for their project and then leave with that information, so we have this kind of poverty of data that cannot be moved from one place to another. And so then that gives us really important questions around who owns information, who owns data. And so I think that's something that we'll all be able to discuss. I'll leave it there for now. I think we have a lot to discuss together, but thank you so much for that time.
Thanks, Soraya, for that brilliant analysis. Is very, very coherent and bringing a lot of strands together. I think also emphasized when we talk of overcoming inertia, it's not just at this global level or systems level, but also kind of comes down to a country level where humanitarian systems have been operating for many, many years or decades in certain instances. And there is an inertia in the way a humanitarian system operates and fails to engage with these broader political dynamics, drivers of conflict, but also drivers of peace. So we'll nearly wrap it up. I just wanted to bring some of these ideas together as well around some of the mutual aid aspects and to bring potentially a positive kind of angle in some of the themes we're talking about, and hand back to Min to talk a bit about humanitarian resistance and mutual aid in Myanmar when we're talking about what might the future look like. And Myanmar has been a very fraught context with the military asserting very violent control and access restrictions for decades, essentially. And you've seen in recent years, since the military coup, this uprising of humanitarian resistance and mutual aid, which has been really quite pioneering. So I was hoping, Min, you might be able to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you. Before I start, so thank you for, we have shared a lot of things. For example, like this diaspora. But when the coup happened, also Burmese living around the world, also diaspora, also started fundraising. That's why we're still doing it as well. But that also comes with what I'm about to say right now. For example, like aid neutrality, right? So what is aid neutrality? But is it really like even like principle dated until now? Because like do you really have to like back to my previous argument, work with the military, it's SAC, for example. That is the way. I don't think so, because, and also another thing is like they also have a problem does it work in Myanmar? I don't think it works, because for example, since, for example, in 2008, Cyclone Nargis, sure you're aware of that. At the time, there was also like try to help international help, but at the time, the military generals, they blocked the aid. So finally, got delivered like some time later, But the aid impact, it is like, so what are we actually, how can I say, we're thinking about it, doing about it, right? Regarding the aid neutrality. So we have to question, I mean, especially international NGOs and also like the UN itself, type of question itself. Because in Myanmar, regarding this, the social movement and then the fundraising project, and so including the UN, a big on NGOs, also the number two I would like to mention is INGOization of resistance. For example, like unnecessary funding frameworks, outdated reporting mechanism, so for example, even with diaspora, we try to contribute, send money for development, for IDPs, for example, people suffering at the border. But there needs to be a strong mechanism, a reporting mechanism that you shouldn't give to the armed struggle, So of course, nobody wants to do an armed struggle, but there has to be all these like unnecessary frameworks. For example, I have a few friends, CSO and INGO, a small group, trying to help fundraising and then try to get funding from international organizations. There's regarding to, I mean, just not even the aid. It's about the media, reform. But none of the organization, international INGO, they didn't want to give them the money because they can't provide any this, for example, the reporting mechanism. So these things should address properly and then change it. And the next thing is that it's a structural problem and not easily fixed, I would say. For example, UN system is not equipped to deal with non-state actors, like many other governments, which Mazan mentioned it already. So what do we do? And UNSC is also fundamentally flawed. China, Russia, as you know, you called it. So we also have to question this whole aid industrial complex, right? Everywhere we go, we've seen in developed countries, we've seen in Africa, we've seen in Asia, So as someone who were born from developed countries, I'm just like, we should question. And last, like when you mentioned it, when they went into the country, they trained all the trainings, many years training provided to local INGO, local CSO, and after the organization left, the project ended, the training left. And the source materials were basically taken, not access to the people. And another one coming again, similar project, started all over again. So what are we doing about that, right? And okay, humanitarian resistance. I believe a few of the solutions, justice and humanitarian need must go hand in hand. You can't just basically give them aid and also like, okay, we'll talk about it later, which is the same approach. And like first you need to get aid and then we'll talk about it when the countries happen, And so, yeah, and also if possible, I know it's a long way, if possible, moving away from the UN framework, UN working style, and supporting localization, like you mentioned it before. Yes, funding local grassroots levels, because there are some INGOs, even in the UK, that they are making sure that the grassroots levels receive the funds they have from big international INGO and donors. They don't have this complicated reporting mechanism. They are actually helping a lot of people here. So I'm not going to mention the name of the INGO, the firm, but they are doing it. So these kind of things need to be addressed and also work together with this kind of organization. And also, not the last thing for me, I want to add is that working with non-state actors. For example, civil society organization like grassroots communities and NUG, for example, this exile government of Myanmar. So that's what I would do more about. Basically, it's just as humanitarian aid has come hand in hand, not about aid only. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Ben. So I think excellent tying together of these ideas around justice, civil society, agency, also around investing in localization and local actors when the times are relatively good. The coup was unpredicted, and then all of a sudden now you have local actors leading the response across the entire country. So I think I'll hand over to Lane, and then we will do Q&A.
We do Q&A now.
Okay.
From the room first, and then we'll take
All right.
online questions.
Excellent. So we are now going to open the floor to Q&A. Please put your hand up. The microphone will come over to you, and we're going to alternate between one question from the room and then one from online, because in the past online has felt a bit neglected, so we want to have an equitable process here. So, and please fire away with any questions.
Thanks. I'll stand up. Cheers. Thanks for the discussion. Very insightful. I have a question for Dr. Mohammed on land tenure. You briefly touched on the, let's say, the tensions between land tenure as a driver of conflict in relation to state governance. And I was wondering that, for example, you're talking about Somalia, but even if we look at the Niger Delta, there's one could argue that the main driver of conflict is actually tensions between locally respected norms of land ownership and national law imposed on it, and frictions created between agro-pastorals and local farmers. And given that this land course from the UN side is very increasingly commodified, and we're going to talk, we will bring in climate smart agriculture, and this is going to solve all the problems. I was just wondering, how do we put in this issue of divergence between respected laws into policy? If you could maybe give me some insight on that. Thanks.
No, I think should I answer it? Sorry, I got excited. Someone says commodification, and I'm like, that's my people. No, it's a really excellent question. And while I'm not particularly an expert on the region that you're speaking of, that particular kind of dynamic is written all through, up and through a lot of the questions that we have regarding questions of land tenure, right? It's the external imposition of particular ways of being and understanding, knowing and using land, and then also particular kinds of commodified, also particular kinds of parcels of land that people are expected to be able to regularize the use of private land. So that very much is the case in a lot of contexts. It's challenging from a Somali context to speak to that traditional dynamic, because there was pre-Civil War private ownership of land. Okay, then there was socialist government, so it becomes very complicated how you actually describe it. The challenge in this context, in the context of Somalia, is actually about, in the context of Mogadishu specifically, is about how we conceptualize different claims to ownership of land in Mogadishu, right? So there is this kind of what you might consider a collective claim to land that almost exists in the aftermath of the Civil War, a kind of autochthonous claim to land that emerges in the aftermath of large-scale clan conflict, right? And so the question becomes, if that's how the rest of the country is parceled out, and that's how people understand what the post-Civil War context is going to be, why shouldn't that, or why couldn't that be a register that people use to understand their relationships of belonging to Mogadishu, right? And so there was large-scale demographic displacement during the course of the Civil War, outflux as well as influx, and this transformed people's relationship to the city overall. What also happened, though, is that as people went into the diaspora and as people went to Sweden and London and all of these other places, they also brought with them documents that existed. And there's a kind of archival politics of war that isn't often discussed, right? There's what people brought with them was land tax bills and title deeds and other forms of proof, witnessing, right, that demonstrated their attachment to particular parcels of land, but also to the city of Mogadishu as a whole. And so when the city itself in around 2011, 2012 began to have a context of more increasing stability, a lot of diaspora started to return. A huge generation of diaspora have started to return. And with them have come these claims, right? These claims that predate the Civil War. This was my home. This was my family's home. And then the question becomes, you and whose army, right? Which of those claims do we prioritize? And this is a really important post-conflict justice question. This is not just about a particular plot of land, but this is about the ability to be able to determine what the future of the city is, what civic participation looks like, what citizenship means in an urban space, who gets to determine what this future of the city is, right? And so it's mediated through brick and mortar. It comes out through a claim to a particular plot of land and home, but there's different kinds of registers, because if I can look at you and say, okay, actually what's happened is the displacement that matters is the colonial displacement. Well, the displacement that matters is the displacement that existed before the paper and the writing and the registration and the archive. But your argument is that you have a piece of paper and you have a very recent claim. Which of those do we prioritize? So these become really important questions of historical memory, as well as political violence, as well as reconciliation, as well as economics, because there's an actual increasing, skyrocketing attachment of value to a particular plot of land, right? And so while it doesn't mark as easily onto the almost traditional binary that we have, which is the traditional African customary land ownership system, and then externally imposed Western land practices, and then that transition, it rhymes as opposed to being identical. Does that make sense? What's important is to have, in the context of Mogadishu, a conversation that overlays different kinds of claims and claims making in the context of land. And while particular cases of land plots may be zero-sum, the wider issue does not necessarily have to be. And that would be my departure point for thinking about that.
Thanks.
I'll now take a question from online. So that's a question for Min. Women's rights organizations in Myanmar have long been neglected by many donors. Do you think that this has changed in any way because of the activism and courage they have shown since the coup?
First of all, I think it should be best answer for a woman, but I can say, but I also like to say I don't represent anyone in Myanmar. I'm just saying on behalf of myself. So in any way, any form, that I'm not speaking over a crowd of women, my fellow feminist sisters. The question is like, is it changed after over the years, right? Because of the activism? I have to say it changed and improved a lot. Especially I worked in the development sectors, and I have my friends from my NGOs and activists. So, but the thing is, like, although it had changed, but they're still facing difficulties, especially from the military, to control the countries, and who basically are known for sexual violence and abuses. That's why I was really, really angry. Like I said about UNFPA head who was in Naypyidaw showing off on Twitter. This is like, it's unacceptable, right? It's more than like ignorant. So yes, things have changed, but since we are the coup in 2021, I would say that I would divide it to two stages. Things have changed, and especially more in awareness raising. For example, like there are like activists, civil rights, women rights organizations are providing trainings or like awareness raising online through channels. So the knowledge sharing is now changing, but the practicality of doing work things inside Myanmar is still ongoing struggle because of the coup. I mean, which is it's already been a struggle and a problem. So if I answer that, yes. But again, I don't represent my sisters. Thank you.
Great points, Min. And also as well, when we talk about overcoming inertia, a lot of the most powerful women-led movements in Myanmar after the coup and before the coup were actually not women rights organizations. They were not CSOs, they were not NGOs. They were like grassroots networks, people just coming together and getting out there on the streets, leading protests across the entire country. And so when we talk about, the international aid system, humanitarian system, and overcoming inertia, that filters down to many different levels of this prioritization to fund NGOs, to fund certain modalities of work, when really some of the most profound work is outside the formal sector. And how can aid actors, donors, NGOs, and UN agencies support these kind of grassroots movements in different ways is really, really critical. Sorry, we have another question over here.
So I actually have 3 questions, but I'll be really quick. The first question is for Min. So you said that you were a human rights analyst and also as an SRH advocate. You also mentioned that the rape or like sexual assault is one of the weapons that the military uses in conflict areas. So as a human rights analyst, are there like any other atrocities that they commit that people do not talk about a lot?
I mean, it's all forms of like atrocities, right? But the thing is that it's a rape as a weapon of war. It's not, like it's all armed forces. It's not only military, You can see in rebel forces, it's around the world. You can see in different insurgent groups, militias. So I was just saying that especially on that the topic, because it was asked by women crowd. So of course, there are also many, many forms, like, I mean, different forms. Like, for example, have you seen the yesterday of like, burning alive, for example, captivating, there are a lot of atrocities, It's just like a different way of forms, I will answer that.
The other two is for Marcin. The first one is when you said like you will need more than humanitarian aid, like you need political assistance, like political aid as well. As far as I understood, Syria political situation is also very complex in a way that it has international state and non-state actors like Assad government, Syria regime, and Russia and Iraq supporting them, and Western, US and Western allies supporting the rebellious group as well. And also there are like Gulf states as well. So it is like very complicated. And when you say like these two, like Russia and the US, they are like supporting two different groups, both of them at the UN Security Council. Like it is like very like, like it is very complicated. So when you say like you will need more than humanitarian aid and political interventions, then what kind of interventions or what kind of assistance that are you referring to? Because I'm from Myanmar, by the way, and I'm doing a cross-sectional study of Syria and Myanmar. So like I'm just wondering, like because we're also complicated like that. So what kind of interventions are you hoping to get that? And then the second one is, thank you for sharing the earthquake situation. So the second one is that you mentioned a lot about the earthquake and humanitarian assistance needed there. Like, what about the other parts of Syria where the Syria regime, like Assad government, is ruling? I'm sure there is still a lot of humanitarian aid and like conditions also really, really bad. What about the condition there? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, the situation here is very, very complicated. But to be honest, I think every conflict is that complicated. It's not unique to Syria. I mean, we live in a world. I think every conflict has international projections and different powers. So it's not just unique to Syria. I know that everyone loves to think that's my struggle is unique, but I think this. Okay, so what I mean by the political process. So there is a UN political process, a UN peace process that was initiated in 2014. Sometimes it's referred to as the Geneva process. So we have a political process in place that actually it lasted for only 2 years, right? But then because of the Western allies' withdrawal from Syria, there has been an asymmetrical power relations within that political process, and it was somehow handed over to Russia. So Russia has the upper hand on the political process for quite some time, and that, of course, led to a stalemate situation. So in 2019, because of the Syrian civil society lobbying efforts, I would say, the political process was re-energized and reconstructed. So it's not just only the opposition, the traditional opposition groups versus the Syrian regime. The Syrian civil society said, stop with this track 2, track 1, nonsense, because we are from the ground. You're on the ground. So if you want an actual political process, we need to be on the table. We need to be sitting on the table, because the opposition doesn't represent us, and of course the regime doesn't represent us as well. And actually, that's led to the creation of something called the Syrian Constitutional Committee in 2019, which actually is like 3 blocks. So you have the Syrian regime bloc, the traditional opposition bloc, and the civil society bloc. So the civil society became an actual negotiators, right, sitting at the table, setting the agenda and all of this. However, at the same time, because of the lack of international interest in Syria, the same problems of these asymmetrical power relations remained in the Constitutional Committee, and it also failed to produce any tangible outcomes. I can give you lots of examples because I'm part of that committee. And we met around 8 times in Geneva. And you could see, for instance, when we're meeting in a negotiation room, outside there will be the international delegations. You will see hundreds of Russian diplomats and maybe like 2, 3 other Western diplomats, right? And So the regime doesn't really feel any kind of pressure, political pressure, to make any meaningful concessions. So when we say that we need a political process, it means that we need some of our allies, the Western allies, to actually invest or to create more pressure and more heat on the regime. How can you do that? There are many ways to do this. One of them is a better utilization of sanctions. So as you know, there are a lot of sanctions in Syria, individual sanctions and sectorial sanctions as well. And I certainly believe that the sanctions are, in Syria, they don't really work. Because they've been implemented now for 10 years and they haven't actually made any real difference. And I believe because the sanctions were imposed for the sake of sanctions. And we've been telling some of the Western allies that, look, sanctions should be a vehicle to open up bargaining spaces, right? It should be utilized in order to get some concessions from the regime, but that never happened. We need better utilization of sanctions. Also, I have to do like a shout out for the civil society as well when it comes to the accountability efforts outside of Syria. So there've been now a proposal to create a special tribunal or exceptional tribunal for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. There have been an enormous efforts actually at the international judicial system. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, 5 months ago ruled. So there was a case brought by Canada and Netherlands against the Syrian regime for torture and systematic torture, and the ICJ actually ruled against the Syrian regime provisional measures. There are also some trials that are happening in Germany about Syrian intelligence officers who were involved in torturing and systematic torture and rape and sexual violence inside of Syria, because Germany has a universal jurisdiction within their constitution, so they're allowed to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity that happen outside of Germany as well. So we use that also for our advantage, and other countries might follow suit. So, for instance, last month, a French court issued an arrest warrant against Bashar al-Assad for the use of chemical weapons against civilians, and these all are civil society efforts. This is all the diaspora efforts outside of Syria. So we want to increase this kind of legal pressure and political pressure in order to reactivate the political process in a way that the regime could actually make meaningful concessions and to make this process move forward. As for the second question about the situation in regime-held areas, it's really, really bad. It's very, very bad. My parents still live there, or some of my family still live there. Despite my harsh criticism of the UN, and I think the UN largely failed in Syria, specifically in northern Syria. However, when it comes to the regime areas, I think the UN is the most essential lifeline for Syrians in the regime-held areas. And that's why we always say, look, we want to keep supporting the UN mechanisms throughout in regime-held areas, but we also need we need regulations for NGOs and INGOs to be able to work there, which is now it's nearly impossible, right? So I'll give you an example. There is a big organization called the Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS. They're a huge medical organization working only in northern Syria, and they wanted to provide support for other Syrians in regime-held areas, but they're not allowed by the Syrian regime because they will be prosecuted, they will be jailed. And other organizations, when there was a fire, huge forest fires in regime-held areas, the White Helmets in northwest Syria said, please give us permission to go and help and rescue people in regime-held areas, but the regime refused to do any sort of that. So we need better regulations. We don't have any regulations actually in Syria for civil society. Civil society is a taboo. You cannot say civil society in regime-held areas. So we need better regulations, better laws. We need more presence of NGOs and INGOs in regime-held areas, and of course we need the UN to continue supporting people there, but in a more accountable manner. So one last example about the UN there. A couple of months ago, there's a brilliant Syrian organization called Syria Legal Development Program. They publish a report called A Few Bad Apples, the procurement policies of the UN in Syria. And they basically look at the procurement policy that the UN is doing in Syria, and they found out that the UN I'm not exaggerating, the UN is paying millions of dollars to war criminals. So people are on sanctioned lists by the US, by the UK, by the EU for being war criminals. They're receiving a lot of money from procurement contracts with the UN. One of these people who received over $1 million from the UN, he was personally involved in something called the Tadamon massacre, which is a massacre that happened in Damascus against Syrian Palestinians who were shot on the street and they were buried in mass grave. And this guy, who appeared in videos in this massacre, he received a lot of money from the UN because he has, I think, like a supplier company or something. So we need the UN to continue supporting Syrians in regime areas, but in a more accountable way, in human rights, respecting human rights. And of course, we shouldn't say that, but don't give money to human rights abusers and war criminals. This should be like, we should go without saying, but it seems in the Syrian context, we have to say it. Yeah.
Regarding the last point, I would like to add as well. So, for example, it's not only the UN though; it's like basically diplomats. For example, in Myanmar in 2014, 2014, when the first EU ambassador went into Myanmar, he basically rented a house of the ex-generals. When people are calling out, including me and my friends, they just ran out. They recently moved out until when the coup happened 2 years ago. The 3 EU ambassadors actually lived there. And at one point, one of the ambassadors, old one, was even mentioning that it felt really good to actually live like this. I mean, not, of course, official, but out of context, in a social event. That's one thing. And also, that's now a UN again. I remember back in early days of 2000, I was still back in Myanmar at the time, UNODC actually worked together with Myanmar Police Drug Force, who were supposed to basically, just work together. But instead of that, I don't know what happened. It's just like more like the typical project money used. But the police chief force at the time became richer and richer, even send kids to international schools, So that's, it's like you said, it's without going saying that don't give money funded to the criminals or the killers, but that's part of the system. I don't know, Yeah.
Question online first. So this question for all of the panel. So how can humanitarian actors navigate their role within what could be termed as non-state entities framework during crises, such as in northern Syria, in Somaliland, and on the border population in Myanmar?
Could you say that again?
Yes. So how can humanitarian actors navigate their role within the non-state entities in northern Syria, Somaliland, and on the border in Myanmar?
Okay, who wants to do that?
In the context of Somaliland in particular, I think there have been established channels and relationships for international actors to work within the context of Somaliland. In fact, humanitarian actors who go there often walk the streets in Hargeisa and have no challenges whatsoever in that. So I think if we're talking about the questions of, I think the real issue is the areas that are hard to reach, and these are areas that are governed by Al-Shabaab in the south, that the state itself doesn't have access to, and that particularly when it comes to questions of fragile humanitarian aid access becomes impossible if not difficult. And this is where I do this every time, but I'm going to embarrass Dustin because his research specifically looks at how localization efforts, specifically in the context of Somalia, rely on local organizations in contexts where aid cannot be delivered effectively by INGOs, and then term that localization, right? As opposed to conceptualizing it in contexts where access is available and possible. It's the necessity of it almost comes under the basket of localization, if that's a fair argument of your work. So I think that would be the context where humanitarian aid actors have the highest challenge.
Do you want to elaborate on northern Syria? Because I feel like there could be similar dynamics.
Exactly. I would say actually very similar dynamics, to be honest. But I would add to that well, non-state actors is a very broad term. So if we're talking about non-state armed actors, and here I think I'm not a humanitarian worker, but I think sometimes it is inevitable to walk or to navigate or to walk through with some of these actors. But in the Syrian case, we found over and over that working with local NGOs and local grassroots organizations, they're the ones who know how to navigate this kind of power relations and how to actually deliver the aid to the people who needs it. And there are many, many examples of this where big NGOs had problems navigating the power relations and how to reach specific areas. And they relied on very grassroots groups in order to do that. And they were successful. And may I say, most of these examples, most of these grassroots I'm talking about are mainly women-led grassroots initiatives that really are able to navigate this. So my opinion would be working at the grassroots level, looking at the women-led grassroots efforts or initiatives inside of Syria. They know how to navigate and because they've been doing this for ages, so they know how to navigate the power relations and the hierarchy and the structures and the social structures and all of that. But also, may I say that, speaking of this, because you mentioned also the accumulation of knowledge and how they came and then just they accumulate knowledge and they leave. I believe, I don't know if this is relevant, but I believe also all of the NGOs and international NGOs working in Syria, they also need to, not just in Syria, in a conflict, we need some sort of decolonization of aid delivery. So I believe like one of the most recent, most effective social movement in the UK was the decolonization of curriculum in most universities, which is a student-led movement, right? And I think we need something similar when it comes to the international system and to INGOs, in order to be able also to do an actual localization of funds. So you mentioned that example and many other examples. There are many terms which I believe are very colonial, for instance, like empowerment. I hate that term. It's like, because it's like people don't have any agency and we're just giving them power, which very colonial, right? And capacity building. I did an interview in Northern Syria once, and with an NGO worker, and he said they've been doing capacity building for us for 12 years. Should we graduate by now? And he's like, should stop with this. I mean, yeah. So I think, yeah, this is also like.
And also the term educating. I avoid using that term, especially to talking to. It's like educating, like you're not educated, you're barbarian, you know. That's why you're educated. So regarding, I mean, the border, Myanmar border, I would just like to repeat what I said before. So basically, I mean, supporting localization, working together with grassroots level groups, and you can even work with like civil society or INGO. I mean, like for example, like a development committees group. Work together with, for example, armed forces like currently in KNU. KNU can deliver a lot of things stuff, also in other things as well. You don't have to work with ethnic armed forces in general. You can work with other civil society organizations. You don't have to go through the military, SITA, for example. And I'm not also not saying that in Thailand, for example, right, a lot of these things, like Mazen said, it was interesting because one of the incident happens in Korean IDPs in 2022, if I remember correctly. The aid and the things needed, like the materials, things were came from the local people in Masot and Burmese diaspora, arrived faster than the actual coming from the government, from the UN, you know, and INGO. Not only the UN, but also the big INGO as well. And the last thing is basically include lifting this lifting colonial funding restrictions, right? Some of them still use this kind of thing. And also out of touch reporting mechanism. Like, why do you need a report for? Like, for example, you want to fund organization and you have to have, for example, registration. They are CSO. There's no time to register. It's in the middle of the crisis, revolution. How can you register yourself or your organization? Plus, they are CSO, you know. So some of these restrictions from big INGO, not only the UN. You know, sometimes there are some UN-led small grant projects which they just, you know, work together. They don't even ask, but also some INGOs as well. So instead of working together with INGOs, local CSOs, directly, rather than giving the fund to these big INGOs, which they'll divide it, staff salary, high level, sitting in Masao, Chiang Mai, and then just renew to contribute later. So these things should be addressed. And decolonize the whole aid process as well. Thank you very much.
Cool. And I think that there's always these questions of how do you scale that? And I think Myanmar is really pioneering a lot of this, of networks upon networks that are capable of absorbing and vast amounts of money and delivering it to the hardest to reach places. So it's not necessarily this question of possibility to scale, but overcoming inertia. Anyway, another question over here.
My question is for Min. You say move away from the UN system. And while I share that point of view, some would say this is an extreme solution. The UN and the Security Council were established because the world order changed at the time, and the permanent seats were given because of the importance of each country's role in the aftermath of the Second World War. Since then, the composition has disproportionately empowered the P5. So the question is, with this power distribution today, is it even possible to move away from the system? And without being blocked. And what do you think would be the first step if it was to happen theoretically?
Theoretically, so I'm not a policy analyst, so I'm not going to answer the theoretically. It's just that, yeah, if it's very much possible, right? So that's a similar argument that you and INGO use the whole time. Do you want to get blocked? Or do you want to be just do things, right? Instead of trying to find ways of working on the situation, what it says that do you want, like I said, right? UN always being prioritized humanitarian access than the actual things happen on the ground. So that's the same argument that we've been here for a long time. So that's why we are suggesting, requesting, pushing for them to work closely with the local organizations, because I don't think, especially with the war order today, it's very hard to change because right now the seat is there because of the World War II, right? So that'll be my answer, to the question. Yeah.
A question that is similar to this is how do you all see the current composition of the UN Security Council? Permanent members, besides human, maybe Surer and Mazen.
I think it's great. I don't think there's any edits I would make at all, actually. No, I think obviously it's a continual system of intransigence that are right at the beating heart of the Security Council, of course. It's very uncomfortable that it is a number of formerly and contemporarily colonial powers that effectively get to govern what happens in the rest of the world. It's not awesome.
I just want to, I agree with that analysis, and it's really difficult to. I think it's a huge question, and people could spend ages trying to answer how to reconstruct and the Security Council. There's been proposals about like a rotation of vetoes. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this, but I can say for certainty, like in the Syrian context, for instance, the humanitarian assistance through the border, which is called the cross-border aid, they decided that this should be at the mercy of the Security Council. So each year, Russia, which is the main ally for the Syrian regime, threatens to veto that resolution. And the West say, okay, what do you want in return not to veto it? And the Russians just control the narrative, and they make it, they introduce new language and all of that. And the cross-border resolution started with 4 border crossings, right? And then they ended up with 1 border crossing. And then now, actually, and finally, after 10 years of this, they finally veto it. Said, okay, no more cross-border resolution. And for 12 years, Syrians have been saying, this decision should not be made by the Security Council. This is a humanitarian decision that shouldn't be made by the Security Council. It's part of the UN mandate and charter, and it should be made by the General Assembly, or authorization from the UN is needed actually for providing humanitarian assistance. So I believe there are certain aspects that should be kept out of the Security Council, primarily providing humanitarian assistance to affected population or to people in need. This shouldn't be a political discussion, or no one should veto a resolution saying that the UN should provide assistance or aid to an affected population. So maybe this is something that needs to change, that some sort of like a humanitarian nature decisions should not be made by Security Council, should be made by General Assembly when there's some sort of an, at least there's no veto power or something. And then, yeah, so maybe that's a start of reimagining this whole dysfunctional system.
I think these conversations are rising again now when it came to Gaza and calling for a ceasefire and calling for humanitarian aid. So definitely needs a considering again.
Exactly, yeah.
Should we take another question from the?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have two questions. I don't know, you can answer whatever, and they're general. The first one is, we were talking about demilitarization and militarization of humanitarian aid, and obviously, theoretically, we're all against putting aid to the military. But for example, in Sierra Leone, after the 1997 coup, the fact that they tried to defund the army actually brought to another coup, because the army was made of people still who weren't given enough maybe recognition, we could say, and they were angry at that, and then it was obviously not the only reason, but there was one of the reasons why they started to ask for more even after that. While in 2002 they tried to put more effort into recognizing them, they gave them more funds, they gave them more money to even more like every one of them, but mostly the senior. And that actually helped to stabilize their situation for a bit. So what is the tension between giving money to the army and saying, okay, we recognize you, maybe we need to give you something, and saying, okay, no, we can give money to you while there are other priorities in the country? And what do you think about this? And another question is about AAP, because you mentioned AAP, and I think it's very relevant, and I wanted to ask how effectively can you do that, and what is the tension between care and control, because humanitarian agencies and aid is based on gathering data that is obviously, even after like crises like earthquakes, are very helpful to inform policies, but at the same time we're like, these agencies have the data of all these people's individuals, and they could actually be used in potentially in many different ways, and at the same time we are patronizing what we think that is they should do, and what we think that we can have this data without maybe sometimes their permission, and I don't know. Thank you.
I would answer the AAP, the accountability affected population. I think it is feasible and it's doable, and I think we have a good start in this. So 2 years ago, because of the Russia's constant threat of the cross-border aid through the UN, so a lot of donor countries, they were thinking about, okay, when that time comes, when Russia finally vetoes any sort of humanitarian assistance to northern Syria, we need to find alternatives, right, to deliver aid, whether through the UN or outside of the UN. So two years ago, there was something, it was actually pioneered by FCDO and the EU and other major donors, called the AFNS, the Aid Fund for Northern Syria, which is basically a mechanism that was established by FCDO and other donors, EU, outside of the UN cluster system or the UN mechanism, in order to continue providing aid to Northern Syria without the consent of the government or the Security Council, which was a very brave move, to be honest. And it was also, it came from because of years of lobbying of civil society and advocacy about this. What they did, of course, at the beginning, there was some problems with it, but then because of the accountability of affected populations, also kind of a demand of Syrians. So they created a steering committee, and they invited Syrian actors, Syrian NGOs to be part of that committee in order to take decisions about the money that's been transferred through this mechanism. And over the years, this steering committee started to be more representative of more local NGOs in northern Syria. And because they're working on the ground, and most of them, it's their area as well. So they've been, I think, doing a great job in kind of reflecting or voicing the concerns of their local communities to this platform. So this is a good start, and it's applicable, and it's feasible if there was a willingness to do so. Of course, the problem is that this platform, it doesn't have the same funding as the funding that goes through UN mechanisms and UN clusters, but I think it's a good start, and I think it should be replicated in other content. And here, in a way, you're actually involving the affected population in the decision making. It's not perfect, but they're a gradual increase, step by step. I think it's important. But again, the second is not the most important thing. It's like, of course, the participation decision making is important, but also, and that's something civil society also pushing for, is human rights to a human rights based approach to humanitarian assistance. Exactly what you said, that respecting human rights and dignity of the affected population, respecting the privacy, not sharing the data with any third party, and all of that, because it happened in Syria actually. There was a UN created something called the deconfliction mechanism, which actually they ask medical organizations to share coordinates of hospitals not to be bombed, and then a lot of these hospitals were actually bombed directly by Russian warplanes. So MSF issued a very brave statement saying we will not share any coordinates with the UN about any hospitals in Syria anymore. So there was a breach, a huge breach of data that actually led to the destruction of many hospitals. But here, I think when they're doing a better job in trying to preserve some of these data, but again, it's still a very small scale pilot project, but I think it has potential to actually become an alternative to the UN cluster system, which I'm not saying we should continue funding the UN, of course, and the UN cluster system, but because of the politicization I was discussed, this mechanism give us more flexibility in terms of funding and reaching areas and all that.
Syria, maybe you could talk briefly about this military funding aspect, because there's a lot of the government liberation of a lot of territory in Somalia, and what does that mean for the international aid system as well, and governance within Somalia?
Yeah, so recently, over the past few years, there have been quite a few gains on the part of community armed groups, but also the state support for the liberation of territory from al-Shabaab. And so then there's a large question about what it means to A, maintain that territory, and B, actually integrate it into the existing federal government system. These are areas that, for the large part, have escaped political affect or reach from the central government for going on a decade, I suppose, and integrated not just politically, but also socially very deeply into the al-Shabaab system. So the question then becomes, what does the liberation of these territories by the state, the liberation of these territories by local communities actually mean for prospects for peace and prospects for stability going forward? It's anyone's question. This is a very fluid situation going forward, but one of the really important critiques is about deprioritizing the priority of liberation of particular lands does not necessarily mean that the funding or the infrastructure that is necessary in order to be able to support those incoming populations afterwards is necessarily readily available. And so, yeah, I think there comes a question where how, in a context of rapidly changing and fluid political allegiance, but also infrastructure and community cohesion, the question becomes how quickly can we mobilize the resources in order to be able to serve these populations, but also to create infrastructure which allows them to not necessarily have, not necessarily feel that that it was better in the past, really, to be honest. And so that's the question that faces quite a few of the future liberated territories, and it's honestly a very open question as to where it goes next.
Thanks for that. I think we're getting close to the deadline because we have a strict 8 o'clock exit, but it maybe be lovely to have some concluding thoughts from all the panelists, maybe 30 seconds, key messages, particularly around this theme around overcoming inertia. I know it's been somewhat of a tour de force across many different topics and many different contexts, but it would be lovely to hear a few final words from each of you. Min, if you'd like to kick it off.
So I would just like to answer a little bit, and also that's also the last comment of your question as well. So yeah, I mean, it's not like like you recognize them and then they recognize them, give them access or die, because the militaries in general, they're killing people every single day. So it's just that yeah, so it's totally understandable that, but it's not like we are not arguing advocating for not to engage with them, because what Ricardo's already said, international organizations, especially the UN, the governmental, they will engage with them. But what we are saying is that you should engage more with also with the local organization, because right now at the stage that what happened was that the local international organization look like Mazen mentioned earlier, like local CSO, as these people will come and ask money, instead of proper like them. And so what they do is that they give money, and there's all this struggle, the interaction between the local CSO and then INGO, and also with the UN as well. And also the trainings provided, it's not the actual like other trainings, it's just the same kind of capacity building training, because they have a project to go for the next 5 years. Like the EU development project in Myanmar for economic development. What kind of economic development are you talking about? For example, something like that. So I'm not saying that it's do or die, but just saying that it should engage more. So that'll be my advice. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks.
I think I've learned as much from this panel as I can see everybody else has. So I think one of the questions around inertia that I started off with was this question of protractedness. But we can see that the inertia doesn't just exist in the context of the crisis itself, it also exists sometimes in the response to that crisis. I think what's being offered by quite a few of the panelists here are ways of thinking about reorganizing, reconceptualizing really entrenched hierarchical power relations within our international system so that we can better meet the needs of very disaffected communities. And I think there are a million possibilities that I think each one has spoken to about what that looks like, but thematically what's common is an analysis of the ways that the contemporary aid, humanitarian, and developmental systems have failed particular kinds of communities in contexts where crisis is continual, compounded, and ongoing, but also a need to understand less hierarchical, if not unhierarchical, means of negotiating economic resources, negotiating access, negotiating knowledge, and then also translating that into even our highest international systems. This is not something that's going to happen likely in the course of a year or a decade. This will be an ongoing project, I think, from the activist, academic, and intervention fields. But it's great to see that there's so much cohesion, and I think communities and locations of solidarity from within these silos will help us to be able to achieve these at a global scale. So that would be my suggestion.
I think that's a perfect suggestion. So it's tough to follow. I totally agree with my fellow panelists about everything they said. I just want to add something very, very quick, maybe just with regard also to localization, all of this. I genuinely believe that all of the meaningful changes, social changes, political changes that happen in the world happen from below, from bottom up. And I believe meaningful changes in the international aid system should also happen from below, should also happen from the bottom up. And I think local NGOs and local CSOs are trying their best to change that, but I think they cannot do it by themselves. I think also INGOs should also be part of that movement, part of that change. And in order for, again, to be accountable to the local population, and for the local population to be part of the decision-making power. This is so.
Thank you. Should I? Okay. I think I there was a theme of localization that emerged from all the panelists, but I think to keep engaging with that is to retain credibility with the local actors and to maintain this engagement, to give them resources to conduct their own local diplomacy and to carry out their own development. And because, as we saw in Syria, as we saw in Gaza, the spotlight will return on these neglected crises through one way or another. So when the spotlight returns, you already have the established networks with the local actors.
Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, I don't have much to add. It's been excellent. The panelists have been fantastic. So maybe just a round of applause first. And just touching on some of what has been said around localization and action, overcoming inertia, like, yes, a lot of this is bottom-up, grassroots, that's important, but a lot of INGOs, UN agencies, donors also have the opportunity to support these processes and accelerate them, and also get out of the way often is part of it as well. So really encourage action across all different levels. Just a final wrap up that, yeah, we're a humanitarian policy group, and we welcome ongoing discussions and engagement. We have social media, ODI_HPG. So please, other way around, HPG_ODI. You can tell I don't have a great deal of social media myself, but you should definitely get involved in that. We have a newsletter, which is also super interesting. We publish regularly. We're doing a lot of different analysis across different contexts, different themes. So we welcome your engagement and collaborations as well, because we realize, it's a big ship that we're all trying to turn in different ways. So whether you're academia, activists, donors, we really welcome kind of, united push to turn things in a better direction. But yeah, thank you all for attending, and look forward to further discussions.
Feedback form surveys, if you can fill those, please. And for online, we've just posted a link in the chat. If you can fill those, that would be very helpful. Thank you.